I oftentimes ask people about their relationship with God. Have you ever put your trust in Jesus? When was that time when you had that experience of getting to know Jesus in a personal way? And oftentimes I'll hear this kind of an answer. And maybe you've given this kind of answer. The answer is like, well, I've known God my whole life. And I understand that. Maybe you were raised in a Christian home. Maybe you went to church a lot when you were a kid, or even a little bit, or you went to different events, this kind of stuff. So you grew up around it. Maybe you were blessed. Maybe you had parents that read the scripture to you. I mean, that kind of thing. But there is a moment where you meet God personally. When you come face to face and Jesus comes into your life. And so when I'm asking that question, that's what I'm asking about. When did you meet Jesus? And I love when people tell me that story. And oftentimes when they begin to tell me that story, they tear up. Because again, it's more than just information about stuff that's happened in their life where God was around them. It's like there was this moment. Or there was this period of time and it culminated in this. It's a cool thing. So today, what I want to do is I want to take you to introduce you to a guy by the name of Moses. Old Testament of your Bible, the book of Exodus, chapter 3 is where we're going to be. And this guy, Moses, we get to see a guy who wrote the first 5 books of our Bible when he meets God for the first time. I mean, he was raised around it. He even talks in the verse at the end of our passage today about God introduces him as the God of his father, his grandfather, his great-grandfather. We get that, but it's that moment where he has a personal relationship with God. But here's what's fascinating, and what we're going to see today is he's going to find out who God is. We hear who God is defined all the time. People tell us who they think God is. And so we repeat that oftentimes, and we're oftentimes the ones who even repeat some of that, and it's oftentimes not really who he is. There's a simplicity in who he is that's going to be shared with us today. By the way, our series is called I Am. We've been planning this for quite a long time. The second part of the series is the I Am has sent me to you. We're going to talk about God's calling. If you're wondering, is God ever going to call me, and what has God called me to? You got to come back this week. I just want to talk to you about who God is. We're going to go backwards a little bit. If you've been with us all this year, you've heard us talk about Hebrews chapter 11. Moses is mentioned in that great faith chapter in Hebrews chapter 11. But if we even just go back to Exodus chapter 1, it begins to tell us the backstory that leads us to the story. Here's the backstory. A couple months ago, we were having a conversation in a series called My Name is Joseph. It was about a guy who was in a family, bunch of brothers not happy with the fact that he got to lead in the family business, and so they decide to gang up on him. They throw him in a pit. They sell him off to slave traders. He ends up in the home of an Egyptian, and ends up being really grabbed by the guy's wife, and he runs from that, and he ends up being thrown into prison as a result of that, and he ends up interpreting some dreams in prison. He ends up being put into this high place in the Egyptian government where he's able to oversee their whole food system, and so it's like you have this bad thing happen, and then all of a sudden the guy rises up to new levels, and then a bad thing happens. He rises up to new levels. He ends up saving the whole country and really the then known world from certain death from famine, because God had given him a dream, told him what was coming, and he helped his people prepare for it. And at the end of the day, his family, who lived far away from Egypt, he ends up bringing them into Egypt, and they are actually given a really sweet deal. They're provided for, blessed in that place, and taken care of. Well, then you fast forward the story a little bit. You get to Exodus chapter 1 and a little more of the backstory of where we're going from today. The Pharaoh that Joseph was under dies. And so the new Pharaoh or new pharaohs over hundreds of years, they don't remember what Joseph did, and they don't remember why Joseph's family was there. Now, Joseph's family's having kids, and their kids are having kids, and this whole group, the Hebrews, God's chosen people, are just expanding and growing in number, and more people are existing until all of a sudden, you're a couple hundred years down the road, and the Pharaoh is a bit discomforted by the fact that this Hebrew people is growing so large that in his mind he says, what if another country tries to take us over and they send their troops in, and what if these people among our people decide not to hang with us, so this Pharaoh's getting insecure, and they link up with this other country, and then all of a sudden they overtake us, and this Pharaoh's going, I know what that would mean for me, that's bad news, and he says, I need to do something about this. So what he does is he enslaves the people, and he puts them under hard work, and you would think that that would break their back and their will, but what we understand is that the Hebrew people, they just even had more children, and they just got bigger and bigger and bigger. And so his discomfort grew more and more over this, to a point that he does what all dictators do that are godless, is he begins to try to do population control, and decides that he's going to make sure that the baby boys get killed so that these people cannot reproduce and grow in numbers. You can imagine living in that time where if you have a boy, his life is going to be taken. Our hearts are just horrified by that very thought. Chapter 2 tells us of Exodus that there was this Hebrew couple that has a baby boy, and they didn't want to kill him, obviously. I mean, just put yourself in that spot. So they hide him, and they were able to hide him for 3 months, but at the end of the 3 months, there was just no hiding him anymore. So they made a basket for him and put some pitch on it and closed the lid and took him down to the Nile River and put him in the reeds there, and he was just floating there, and then they went home. I hope somehow you hear and feel the emotion of it. I just can't even fathom what this moment was like. How do you do that? But they don't have a choice. So they put him in the water, and his sister doesn't leave. And I'd love to hear the bigger story of that moment. But you've seen those moments where you've got a kid and something difficult happens, and you just see them out in the yard at the far end, and they just won't move because they're hurting so bad. Later on, you come out, you stand with them, and you talk with them, and they're just crying. Something in me tells me that's what this little sister's doing. She's standing back from the Nile. She sees that basket down there. That's her baby brother in that basket. They've been holding him for 3 months. And she just won't leave. Mom and Dad just had to go, but she won't leave. Well, just then, the Pharaoh's daughter and all of her little people come down to the edge of the river, and this girl's standing there. And they see this basket floating in the reeds, and they wonder what it is, as you would, and they go and they grab it and they open it up, and there's a baby crying in it. And this daughter of the Pharaoh is so taken by this baby, and just then the little sister comes running up, and she says, we've got to save this baby. I mean, this daughter's heart's pulled, even though her dad is the one who has called for the killing of the babies. The Pharaoh's daughter's just heart is grabbed, because that's what we love, babies. It's just unbelievable that so many demonic forces are trying to kill babies. It's always been the case, and still is. She pulls that baby out of the water, and the sister's there almost immediately, and the daughter of Pharaoh turns around to this girl and sees that she's a Hebrew girl, and she goes, do you know anyone that could take care of this baby? I want to adopt this baby, but I need someone to nurse it. Is there a Hebrew mother that could nurse this baby? I will pay them. The little girl goes, well, let me go see. She goes, gets mom and dad. You'll never guess what just happened. Come here. And mom takes her baby back, and now is getting paid to take care of her own baby. Well, this baby eventually goes to be with the daughter of Pharaoh and is raised in privilege in the palace of the Pharaoh. All the foods and all the culture and all the education you could imagine. Even New Testament in the book of Acts, it says, and Moses was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he was mighty in words and deeds. I mentioned the book of Hebrews where he was mentioned in chapter 11, this big faith chapter in the book of Hebrews. His parents were mentioned. We don't know their names. In chapter 2 of Exodus, it says these Levites, speaking of the tribe that they were from, but in Hebrews chapter 11:23, it says, by faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw that the child was beautiful and they were not afraid of the king's edict. And just because that was the culture of the time and, well, we got to follow the leadership. They're like, no, you don't follow leadership that is telling you to do the thing that is not of God that we know is wrong. And in the faith chapter, they take a huge step of faith. And even though they're never even mentioned by name, these people are held up in a big way. And you think about it. This guy, Moses, was destined to die, and he ends up being raised in the palace of the guy who made the edict that he be killed. And his name, Moses, means pulled out of the water. And he writes the first 5 books of the Bible that you have in front of you. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So chapter 3 begins with the words, now Moses. That's going back to what has just happened. Let me tell you what had just happened. The people were put into slavery. The people were groaning under that slavery. And at the end of chapter 2, it says these words, God saw the people of Israel. It's a powerful statement. God sees you. You think he doesn't. You think that you're alone out there just working your tail off, and yeah, you're not one of the special ones that God chose. Somehow in our mind, that's what we think. And there's this reminder at the end of chapter 2 of Exodus. You ought to go there, underline it, highlight it. God saw his people. He saw them in the difficulty that he was in. But listen to what he says next. And God knew. What did he know? He knew the pain they were in. He knew their situation. And the next chapter is going to begin with Moses. So God's going to go do his work. Moses doesn't have a clue about this. But God knew. Some of you need to know this morning that God knows. The pain that you're in, the lostness that you feel, that relational thing that God knows. Might even be worth us saying as a church out loud, God. Might even be worth turning to the person next to you and looking at him saying, God knows. You've been talking about some stuff, right? There's some stuff you're dealing with. I don't know. No one, the rest of us know in here, but God knows. Take a deep breath. I want you to meet that God. He knows. He sees you. He knows. When we start chapter 3, it says, now Moses was keeping the flocks of his father-in-law. That word now says, coming out of all the stuff I told you, there's one thing in chapter 2 I didn't tell you. He's living in a palace. Things are going really well. He's got all this privilege. How do you walk away from that? And yet something inside of him sees the way his own Hebrew people are being treated. And it upsets him. And he sees one of the slave masters one day beating one of the Hebrews, and he goes out and kills the guy. Looks around, thinks no one sees him. Next day, he sees two Hebrews going at it, and he speaks to them, and they go, "What are you going to do? Kill us like you did the guy yesterday?" And at that moment, Moses has this uh-oh moment. And that's where we come into chapter 2. He's just murdered a guy. God's people are in deep trouble. It is getting unbearable. God sees, God knows. And then we read these words. Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. So when he hears this between these two Hebrews fighting, and they bring up the murder the day before, and he gets out of town, he heads out into the desert wilderness. And now he's on the run. He's 40 years old when this happens. Rescued as a child, lives a life of privilege, stands up for people being mistreated. And even his own people turn on him to an extent because they're like, "What are you going to do? Kill someone like you?" They don't know what they're dealing with. So he's out, headed in the wilderness, and it's a long day. He gets out in the middle of the desert, and he sits down at a well. This group of young girls comes up. They've got a flock with them. They have water bottles, and there's these other guys there, and they're treating them horribly. And Moses protects them, does what a man does, and protects these women, and he helps these women, and he fills their jugs up, and he gets their sheep watered, and they go home. And their dad goes, "Whoa, that normally takes a lot longer. What happened?" And probably the girls have been sort of hiding what's been going on in the past. This guy protected us. He treated us so well. Well, where is he? He's back there at the well. Go get him. What do you mean? You didn't bring him home for dinner? Are you kidding me? And they bring him home. And this guy by the name of Jethro gives his daughter Zipporah to Moses to be his wife. Just call her Zipper. If you're pregnant with a girl, there's a name for you. Guys, I want to talk to you for a second. This is sort of like, has nothing to do with the story we're in the middle of, but since I've talked to you, I don't know, I have you guys in my mind this morning. I want every one of you to come to the pig roast this weekend. And it's because I really think, men, we need to step up and be men. This guy Jethro, the father-in-law, later on in the book of Exodus, in chapter 18, he's going to give some business advice. And the business advice was because Moses later on would have millions of people that he'd be overseeing in this location. And Jethro would look at Moses, see him almost at burnout, almost at just crazed look on his face. And Jethro is going to give him some incredible advice about delegating. But when he speaks to him and says, you're going to have to delegate some responsibilities, he defines who to delegate it to. Chapter 18, verse 21, he says, "Moreover, look for able men from all the people, men who fear God, who are trustworthy, hate a bribe." And he says, when you find those guys with that kind of qualification, you've found a good thing. That's why we want this place to be a place where this is a group that has a group of men that stand up for their families, protect women, care for women, who are able, who fear God and lead their family and their church to love and follow Jesus Christ. I mean, it's just passionate about that. And so that's the kind of guy that he's saying, guys, this is who you need to look for. Moses, this is who you ought to look for. And then he gave him the business advice that each of us know and need to follow. He just says, here's what I want you to do. Place such men over the people of chiefs of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, and tens. He just says, listen, delegate it out. Grab these people to be in charge of different areas. And then he says, here's the result of that. And I love the result of great delegation, what Jethro told his son-in-law. One, and this is found in verse 23. He says, if you do this, God will direct you. Oh, that's good. Two, you'll be able to endure. Some of you are in need of that word of wisdom today. Three, all the people will also go to their place in peace. Just a little aside here in the middle of this talk, but I just thought that was helpful. So here's what happens. Moses goes out there in the desert. He's married now to Zipporah. He becomes a shepherd. By the way, Egyptians hated shepherds. So he's been raised as Egyptian. Everyone around him talked about how dirty and nasty shepherds are. Now he gets out there in the middle of the wilderness, and for 40 years, from the age of 40 to 80, he's a shepherd wandering out in the wilderness with these dirty, nasty sheep and watering them and all the hard work that comes with that. That's the lot of his life. This is what he finds himself doing. Exodus chapter 3, verse 1 says, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness, and he came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Horeb is at a place that you may be more familiar as Mount Sinai. As with like any mountain range, oftentimes you'll see a picture of a mountain range and you'll see a couple peaks. On this mountain range, there's the peak of Horeb, which is a little bit lower, and the peak of Mount Sinai. This is where God would give Moses the law. And here he is, he's out shepherding sheep. He has no idea what's going to happen there some 40 years later. He has no idea that someday he would be leading millions in this place. He's alone, out in the middle of the desert with a flock of sheep. That's the scene that you have here in front of you. And may I add, for any of you who feel like you're in a dead-end job, and you feel like, I don't know that there's any future for me. Any of you that are older, when what I'm about to share with you happens, he's 80 years old. There is a real push for youth in our era. When you get to be a certain age, yeah, what's been done's been done, and there's probably nothing major going to happen again in your life. Some of you are even feeling that at even younger ages. Like, I missed that window of opportunity when everyone was able to run through it. And now, yeah, I'm just sort of working this dead-end job. I made a decision, and here I am. Some of you mothers are like, man, it's just like changing one more diaper and wiping one more snotty nose. I don't feel purpose. And it's in that moment that God shows up when you least expect it. I love what A.W. Tozer said. He says, to the child of God, there is no such thing as an accident. He travels an appointed way. Accidents may indeed appear to befall him, and misfortune stalk his way, but these evils will be so in appearance only. Because we cannot read the secret script of God's providence. You know there's a secret menu at that restaurant, right? Oh, I only see what's up there. I don't know the secret menu. There is a secret script of God's providence in your life. He's doing something. I just want to talk to you. I want to talk to each individually, personally. I'm talking to you right now. You have a very important moment ahead of you. God loves you. God has a purpose for your life, and you are in a moment of training. Do not push back on that. This is an important moment. I know it feels worthless. I know you feel like you've missed the window of opportunity. God has a plan for you, and he's working in your life. I want you to come back here next week because I want to continue to talk about that plan he has for you specifically. He has a moment for you, and it's all about him, and it's about his glory. We've come into this moment going, what is there in this for me? Is there something I can dial into God to get a little something so that I can get what I need for me to keep on going in my life? That's not the story of the Bible. The story of the Bible is all about God. There's something bigger. We have sold out for something way too small. Something. It's about me. It's what I want. It's what I need. No, I want something bigger. I want something more. I want something eternal. I want something God. And he says, I have that for you if you'll say yes to me. But first, we're going to have to come to the mountain of God. And that's where this text takes us. To Horeb. The verse says, to the mountain of God. I don't think Moses was thinking this day, but I tell people all the time, I don't know what today's going to bring. It's amazing what a day will bring. Put your head on a swivel. Look around. What's God doing? Some of you are going to be in a rush to get out of here in a few minutes. Put your head on a swivel. There may be someone sitting behind you you don't even notice right now that you're supposed to meet today. There may be something you're supposed to hear today. Don't be afraid when you've been redirected in your life. You're like, I don't know how I ended up in Downingtown, right? You're like, I'll be out of here as quick as I can get out of here. I want to go back home. God says, I have you here for a reason. I'm working on something today in your life that you can't even imagine. Exodus 3:2, let's roll. And the angel of the Lord, this is a pre-incarnate Jesus. Most literally, it's the angel of Yahweh. It's Jesus before Jesus actually shows up in the New Testament. And an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of the bush. You're familiar with the burning bush? This is the burning bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. A burning bush. And a burning bush that doesn't burn up. I have a burning bush story. Guys, this is your day. I'm sorry. I'm thinking of dudes today. Men, we love flame. I said that last hour, and a lady came up afterwards. She goes, you inspired me. I have one of those at home. I'm going home. I'm going to use it. I love flamethrowers. This is my personal flamethrower. I crawled up in the attic last night and pulled it down. And anyhow, you hook this up to a propane tank, and then you light it. I thought security wouldn't be happy if I did that this morning. Might freak them out. They even were looking at it before service. I said, that's mine. They're like, oh. I was wondering why that was laying on the stage. So many of you know I lived in the desert before we came here, desert Southwest. Lots of forest fires out there. Everything's so dry all the time. It doesn't take much, and the place catches on fire. They're thankful this time of year when they get all sorts of rains. And then what happens is all the undergrowth grows up real high, real fast when the rains come because there's lots of sun, lots of rain, and they get all this undergrowth. It's beautiful green. And then the rains stop, and all the beautiful green dries up, and then all of a sudden it all burns. And then when it burns, then the firefighters have to come in and put out the fires, and the forests burn down and all this kind of stuff. Then they have these big, huge, old military planes that can scoop up water out of the lakes, and they put some sort of gel in it. They call it slurry, and it turns bright red. And they fly over the forests, and they drop this. You've seen pictures of that happening, and evidently it puts out the fires. Just there was this day where they were doing that. The fires in our area were just, you could see the smoke, you could smell the smoke, and they're flying over all day long. And I heard that that day they had, by mistake, dropped a load of slurry onto the local car dealership. Every car in the dealership was covered with this orange goop that they didn't know what to do about. Well, anyhow, I had this idea that day that it was time to go out in the yard. We had this beautiful yard of brown rocks. Now, when you first move to the desert Southwest, it's like, why don't they have any grass here? This is sort of ugly, just brown rocks everywhere. Over time, those brown rocks look really beautiful, and you begin to rake them and make them look real nice. And then in the midst of the driest season of the year, you can't understand why, nothing will grow except weeds. And you got to get rid of those weeds somehow. And the ground is like cement, and weeds don't pull out of the cement. And so I learned that if you hook up a torch like this to a propane tank, you light it on fire, a big flame comes out the end. You can walk around your stone yard and you can torch the weeds. And evidently it stops the photosynthesis, which kills the root, and then it dies. It is fun, dudes. I love fire. And, but I'm also an overachiever, and so among my, these low-lying junipers, these green bushes in my yard, there were still leaves around them. And so I just thought, well, we'll get rid of some leaves at the same time. So I was burning leaves, and I love the smell of burning leaves. I don't think that's legal anymore. When I was a kid, my grandpa had a burn barrel, and we put all the leaves in there, and they just smolder, and they have just a great smell. So I'm burning the leaves, and all of a sudden, the juniper bush caught on fire. I mean, it was, I wasn't even close to it, and this is the deal. It's a poof, and the whole thing's on fire. I think I said a bad word, and I know pastors don't do that, but I think I did that day. And I dropped this, and I ran for my garden hose to put out this bush, and the next bush goes poof. And I said another bad word, and just then a slurry plane flew over. And I'm like, oh no, I mean, smoke's going up all over the place, and I'm just freaked out. And I got the water and put out the flame, and I thought, wow, I saw a burning bush. That's my story. The slurry plane didn't drop the slurry on me, thankfully. Let me go to verse 3. Moses, he sees the bush. He says, he's out there alone in the wilderness, and he talks out loud. I'll tell you, I was talking out loud that day too. You see a burning bush that you didn't light with a torch, you're talking out loud. And he says, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why this bush has not burned. And when the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called out of the bush, oh my. Whew. Moses. I almost don't even want to say that. I don't know how that had to sound. What does the voice of God sound like when he calls your name? What would it have sounded like that day? He had heard about God. He knew God. He had known him from his ancestors. Verse 6 of this will tell us that. But the question is, at this point, had he ever met God? No, at this moment, he's going to have his first experience of meeting God personally. It's going to be a powerful, powerful moment. Moses. You know, when God speaks, he has a way of getting through. Moms, there's two different voices you've got. That voice when you call your kid and they keep going and you don't really care. And then there's the voice. I've heard some of you use that voice in the cafeteria. And I get scared. And I come to you and it's not even my name. And normally when you say that name, it's said twice. And God calls him Moses. What do you do when God calls? And Moses says, here I am. I respond. God didn't speak to me out of a burning bush. troubles me. We live in a time where if God did speak out of a burning bush, you'd be amazed how many bushes we'd be burning all over the country. We'd have, spark igniters that we could buy on Amazon that we could light bushes in our backyard, and we'd be trying to say that God spoke out of a bush. That's how God worked in that one situation. We are so blessed today. I mean, Moses is 80 years old before he hears the voice of God, before he meets him personally. In the time that we live in, we can put our faith and trust in Jesus at a young age, and God's Spirit comes into our life. And God gives us his word, and when we read his word, God's Spirit lights it up. It's like, oh, and we have a response because we're hearing from God, and we say, here I am. I'm listening. You've got my attention. When he says, Moses, Moses, and he says, here I am, then God says, don't come near. You call your kid. You want him to get right here, right now. God's like, stay away. You step back, what's going on here? We have a God who is holy. You know what that means? He's not like us. He's separate. There's this tendency in the church, in the world today, to make God in our own image. So he's just one of the dudes, one of the guys, and we could just sort of take him casually and lightly. Hey, God, here I am. I'm back to chat with you now. You're the big guy in the sky. And we just carry it lightly. And when he introduces himself to Moses, he calls him. Moses says, here I am. I'm listening. I'm going to do what you say. And he says, stand back. And when he says stand back, he says, take your sandals off your feet. For the place that you are standing is holy ground. Why is it holy ground? And why does he take the sandals off of his feet? Because God is there. I had this thought in my mind this week. I heard of someone who had their surgery messed up really bad and ended up in an extended hospital stay, and I was being all righteous in my head thinking about medical malpractice. I was having a whole conversation with myself on this and just thinking about medical malpractice. And I was just thinking, man, I guess any of us in our own professions, I mean, we're just people. We can mess up really bad. And so I was thinking of different ways you could mess up in different jobs. And so I was having fun thinking through all that. I have a very active mind. My mind's just going on all sorts of subjects all the time. But so I was carrying this out into all sorts of thoughts, and then all of a sudden I thought, how are you able to bring about malpractice in your world? How, as a pastor of a church, I was like, oh. I mean, I all of a sudden if a plumber doesn't do the pipes right and it floods the kitchen, it's an insurance claim and you get a new floor, right? And hopefully a few other new things. I'm like, if I tell you who God is and don't get it right, eternity's at stake. If we step into this room and do not understand who God is, and we flippantly come to him as if he is some celestial genie here to just give out goods and services and make you a little bit better, and we're not willing to say, whoa, I'll step back. You're holy. This is holy ground. And I was taken in that moment, just recognizing I have a God-given responsibility to share with you, to join with you in coming before the God of creation who wants us to come near. And he makes himself accessible through the person and the work of Jesus Christ. And yet we recognize as we come before the God of all creation that he is not like us. He is holy and he is separate. And when we come to him, we do not do so lightly. I'm going to ask the worship team to come up here right now. And I'm going to invite us as a church to respond to a holy God who's crying out of a bush, Moses, Moses. A God who says, I see you. I know. Who's saying, come here. Take me dead serious. I am the God, holy God of creation. I'm going to invite you right now to respond to him. He wants to meet you. He's calling your name. I've talked to so many of you personally this morning in this message. He's looking you in the face. He's calling your name. He's saying it twice. Would you this morning respond to him? Maybe that means just kneeling down where you're at. Maybe it means staying seated. Maybe it means standing up with your hands up to him just in pure silence. Maybe it means coming down here to the front. We have kneeling pads at the front. And just kneeling down and coming before holy God. I invite you to a God that calls out your name. Moses. Moses. Come near. Holy are you.